Friday, and it's time to tackle tricky issues in learning design and uncover the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. So today, Phil and I are going to be talking about what learning designers can learn from garden design. But before we get into that, we've had quite a razzmatazz media week this week, haven't we, Phil? What with the launch of our book and you on the telly. So what's been going on?
I know. It's like I'm going to need a rider soon. I'm going to, soon it's going to be I need M&Ms and I need to be clapped by strangers whenever I walk into a room, something like that. If you could organise that, Tony, that would be really good.
Yeah, we can put that on expenses. It's fine.
So so we probably need to do a shameless plug about.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, why not?
We've been sort of working way behind the scenes to get it done. But so have you got a copy there to
So here it is. Yeah, Ding's Design Almanac. Oh, hang on, try and get in front of the camera. There we go.
Wow, Tony, Ding's Learning Designer Almanac. Gosh, tell me what's in it.
Well, let me tell you, Phil, when I shameless plug. So it's a short book. It's a pocket book. It's a really handy, nicely digestible, pick it up and just dip into it whenever you like kind of book. And it pulls together all of the content that we created during COVID, because obviously we launched Ding April 2020, and we spoke to a lot of people during that time who were struggling with all aspects of learning and teaching, and had some really interesting conversations. But it was obviously a lot of content was of that period, of that quite a specific period where people were not able to go out and do things. And it was a question of, well, we learned a lot during that time, I think. And it was either all that content just gets lost or there was an opportunity to put it together. So it did feel like there was a good opportunity to put it into a book. But you've done the lion's share of the legwork on this, Phil. So what's been your experience in reviewing the content? What have you learned from looking back at it all?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I know that there's sort of like COVID is one of those subjects that I think now people just go, and I just want to sort of say that it's not a COVID themed book, but what we did is we sort of structured sort of insights sort of around our sort of COVID diary entries. So we sort of did podcasts at the time, and sort of as sort of practitioners ourselves, we were sort of reflecting, during lockdown on the different feelings that we were having and the way we were reflecting on the sort of educators we'd been before the lockdown, and then you and I had to sort of rush in like the emergency services in many ways and have to work with people who were very nervous, and at the same time we were learning at the same time. So it's, in that respect, it's a capture of insights really, and yet those insights are, of course, you would expect this, underpinned by ideas that are far older, if you like, than the pandemic. That you sort of realize that, just like as everyone has said and observed around the pandemic, that all it really did was kind of accelerate some ideas and kind of move some ideas up to the surface where perhaps everyone could see them better. So, but there is a link really between sort of like the main thrust of today's sort of podcast and the book, in so much as that one of the sort of the inspirations around it, why it's like this, why it's meant to be easy and engaging as opposed to sort of overly academicized, is because one of the inspirations in my head was all of those Reader's Digest book of plants and Reader's Digest guide to trees and the Reader's Digest book of bugs that my grandma had on her shelf when I was growing up, and it was like knowledge, but knowledge that you could sort of snack on, and that sort of idea of this sort of field guide, this thing you could sort of carry around in your back pocket. I mean, it looks really smart now, Tony, but I think it'll look even better when it's got a few coffee rings on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it is a bit dog-eared.
Coffee stain on it, doesn't it?
Exactly. So it was that sort of idea of just trying to produce something that you could pick up, and whatever page it opened, there would be something useful, something that you could carry out and sort of take with you out into the field and sort of apply that knowledge. So it's not an academic journal. It's not sort of like creaking under its own references, but what it should do is allow people to snack. Oh, look at you there reading. Look,
I'm just snacking.
And then just sort of take those insights away with them and use them. So that sort of usability and that sort of utility, it was really important, I think, just in terms of like when I think about how perhaps I began to get interested in gardening, it wasn't through a journal, a long read about gardening. It was through these little digestible journals that sort of enabled me to imagine me and that knowledge happening at the same time in a particular place. So that was kind of the idea behind it, really.
Yeah, I think it's come together really well. It's great, and the idea of you've got the takeaways where, like, if you just want one page some quick tips on cognitive load theory, you've got some of that, but you've got a longer form reads on some of the key learning experiences that people were having and how they were struggling with moving to online learning. But you've got things like the virtual campfire, so some of the techniques, I suppose, the maneuvers that we learned during lockdown, things learning design maneuvers. It was really interesting to look back and review some of that content and see how it helped us, as you say, to make visible some of these practices that were really handy during the periods of lockdown, but were actually derived from much older learning principles. They just really demonstrated their usefulness in those situations of extreme crisis. It was like, hang on, we do know stuff about what makes good learning, and it's great to see those pulled together and related to the experiences that people were having. So yeah, I think it's nice. And we've got Rays of Light, our resident agony art, Ray Martin, answering people's questions. We've got some postcards from Nicholas, resident curriculum design expert. So
some of the other stuff, I was just thinking of the annuals I had as a child, or where you had a little picture and that kind of stuff. So that's it. That's the tone of it. I would say that it's a classically sort of like affable and engaging and useful idea. And I would say that sort of like in that respect, that's a ding thing. I think that sort of, what's the point of being useful to people if that usefulness perhaps becomes cloaked in its own complexities and the mystiques of the subject? I think both you and I have been teaching for long enough to be quite exasperated and perhaps impatient with the notion that knowledge has to be kept on the highest shelf and has to be complexified in order to produce the experience of having to fight for knowledge. I think that actually giving knowledge away is a profoundly more interesting and useful relationship to have with people. So
yeah, and giving it away in a usable way that you can put into practice quite quickly and easily without having to spend lots of time decoding it, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Or sort of getting on board with some kind of tacit language, or to sort of, it's not a club. I think a lot of people perhaps view knowledge as a club with very strict membership rules and customs and sort of ways to get things wrong. And I don't know. I think that gatekeeping knowledge is was certainly one of the things that you and I encounter and talk about and perhaps mitigate when we work with other people or we move into institutions or organizations. It's like you just need to give this stuff away. Yeah. I mean, that's your job, to give it away and let other people have your stuff. That's the bottom line, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ding's Learning Design Almanac, available at all good online bookshops, particularly Amazon, which is the online bookshop that it's available from.
Yeah, specifically Amazon, I think it is. But anyway, yeah.
So, but yes, and on to our second media event of the week. So,
yes.
Extending the sort of the gardening theme. So, tell us. So, you are on Gardener's World this evening, Phil?
Yes, this is a true indication that I am officially been welcomed into the hallowed halls of middle age, because I am, in fact, not only am I on Gardener's World, I'm on a repeat of Gardener's World. So the Gardener's World team came to the garden in June, and they came for a specific reason, because they were visiting the area in which I live, and they were looking. It's not just my garden; they were looked at 4 gardens, and the premise of the sort of the piece of the segment was about gardening in an environment where perhaps the prevailing conditions are not thought of as particularly ideal, because we live coastally, we have prevailing wind, we sort of garden on heavy clay. And for any gardeners out there who are listening, they'll know what that means. And for those who aren't listening, it just means that the conditions can be pretty heavy going sometimes, and produces limitations and challenges around your repertoire of plants and the health of your plants, all of those sorts of things. So the reason why they came was to sort of look at how 4 different people had met the challenge of those conditions with intention and with purpose to produce a space that felt just right. So that was why they came. That is why, in fact, I am on the telly talking about my northeast facing garden and the decisions that flow from that particular aspect, which I guess is why you wanted to talk a bit more about it, right?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because since you first appeared on Garden as well, um, this idea of a north-facing garden has actually been quite useful to us, hasn't it? I think prior to that, it wasn't something that we particularly talked about. But when Garden as well shone a light on the fact that you have a north-facing garden and you'd had to design into it and work with it, there have been some quite useful links between that and the work that we've been doing around learning design, about what a north-facing garden is, and it's actually turned into a very useful metaphor for getting started with a learning experience in terms of what are the features of the experience that you cannot change, and not viewing those as a deficit and saying it's like, don't pretend that you've got a south-facing garden, because you haven't. If you plant a south-facing garden and a north-facing garden, nothing's going to grow and everything's going to die. So there's been some really interesting learning that's come out of that around finding out what you can't change about an experience and being very intentional and purposeful about that, and actually using it to get you started straight away, rather than designing an experience that could be anything to anyone. It's like, well, that's not going to work here because the terrain isn't suitable, the constraints aren't suitable. Let's work with what we've got. So what's been the key takeaway for you about this north-facing garden? Because it's an interesting metaphor, isn't it, that's come out of it?
I mean, the key takeaway is that it's an idea that seems to land successfully with other people, which is the job of a metaphor. I think, I started talking earlier, didn't I, about complexification and how, you have to be careful with metaphors, because if you don't understand the metaphor, it's just another layer of complexity, right? And so you're trying to use another thing to simplify a thing, and then the thing gets complicated. So you have to be mindful around metaphor. Having said that, I use them a lot, and anyone who's ever been taught by me, or anyone talks to me for any length of time, they'd be like, wow, he's gone off again, talking about he's using pictures. Yeah. He's using pictures again. But the reason why we're talking about it, I guess, is because in those very initial conversations that we've had with organizations and with clients who are, when we're scoping or beginning to sort of just in those very early stages, think about what the job actually is, like what is the actual ask, what is the brief. Any designer will tell you that the brief, the quality of the brief, your understanding that informs the brief is absolutely key, because a bad brief will take you in a different direction. And so that when we have those first conversations and we're scoping work or talking to people, it's always trying to find that very first conversation about what is the challenge really, what is the problem really, as opposed to what is folklore in the institution, what is like a cultural groupthink, like what is just the effect of one colleague or one person producing a sort of a force field around it. And it's always to make sure that you're not solving the wrong problem. So the north-facing garden has just been quite a disarming way to start those conversations about asking that very simple question about, in terms of the learning experience that you want to produce, or the learning experience you're seeking to enhance, or the learning experience you're seeking to sort of revolutionize, whatever it is what are the things about that learning experience or the environment it takes place in, or what are the constraints that are real and absolute? So I would just bring this back to my garden, which was that we have a northeast facing garden. And when we first took it on, it had been a holiday let house, which meant the garden had been gravelled over with membrane, which meant that the soil itself was dead. It was sour. It was compacted. It was essentially barren. And so one of the things we could do and did do was actually, my husband and I, we excavated all of that poor soil. We moved it out of the garden in wheelbarrows, and we brought in some new soil, some topsoil with some compost. Now, none of that is, I'm not really here talking about compost. What I'm really talking about is the fact that was a thing that we could change. So the soil was mutable. The soil was indeed something around the quality of the conditions, and we didn't have to kind of align ourselves with that, or indeed our decision making. The thing we had to align our decision making to, however, was the fact that our house and our garden faces northeast, which means that no amount of change could change how much daylight our garden got in the winter, or what the sun was doing. There was really nothing we could do about that. And if you face northeast and you don't get a lot of light, it means that you are the plants that are going to look great, the plants that are going to love you back, that repertoire changes. There are flowers and plants you can't have. There are flowers and plants that you might love, and for you might absolutely mean the garden, but you can't have them. And so the first instinct is to let go of these ideas of what you think something could and should be. It is to look at what you can actually have, what you can actually change. And I'm going to be honest and say that from a learning design perspective, those kinds of constraints, right? The thing that you cannot change is always an exciting thing for me, because it feels like something that you can all agree on. That it's like a consensus building moment. It's like this thing is a fixed point. And I've always thought that the next maneuver there is to stop looking at that thing as a deficit, or to stop experiencing it as tragedy. Like, oh, I wish I had a south-facing garden. I'll never be happy with this garden. This garden will always be a non-south-facing garden. Boo-hoo. It's a bit like, want to hold on. And certainly when the people came to have a look at it, I don't think anyone was thinking, oh, I wish this had been a different type of garden. What they were thinking was like, this is exactly right. It sort of works for this space. And that is where I think the learning around learning design and designing learning and walking into other people's experience of learning, that's where it's been really useful to talk plants, or to talk soil, or to talk to talk what the sunlight's doing. I mean, I don't know if you agree. Let me ask you, actually. So there I am banging on about a north-facing garden. Can you identify or exemplify examples of where you, as in your role, have either inherited or arrived at a north-facing garden? Where have you, in terms of learning design, had to sort of work with the prevailing unchangeable conditions?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're right. As you've been talking, it really helps to clarify that idea of the things you can't change and using those as a positive, not as a deficit. I can think of one example where, of course, I was teaching a few years ago, and the class size doubled, but the staffing resource didn't double. So
imagine that.
Yeah, it's strange. How many conversations have we had like that? But that's an example of where you can view that as, oh no, I wish I had a smaller class, or okay, I'm going to have 50 students instead of 25, or I'm going to have 100 instead of 50. And you can't change that. So you can wish for the fact that you had a smaller class size, but you haven't. You have 50 students or 100 students, and you've got to work with that. So it was an example of that is your north-facing garden. You cannot change that. So let's start there and work into that space and go, right, we've got to keep 50 students entertained. We've got to make sure they have a positive learning experience. We've got to harness that cohort. So instead of, if I can't give those learners as much one-to-one time as I would otherwise be able to, let's not do that. Let's not view that as a deficit. Let's say, well, how can we use teamwork? How can we get them to learn from each other and harness the collective experience in the room? And what activities then lend themselves towards that? So instead of individual submissions, maybe we do a group submission. In the end, we ended up doing panel discussions and a conference, because it meant that they could work together, and they had a very good reason to then work together as a group and produce something. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without a larger group. If you suddenly had 10 students, it wouldn't have really worked as a panel discussion. But with 50, it was great. You could have a whole event around it, and it felt like a thing. You could talk about it. So that was one good example of where working into the reality of that and not being annoyed by it actually produced a better experience, I think. And then just thinking about some of the other clients that we've worked with recently, where it was building a data experience course and looking at it was almost, because the brief was quite open, I think, to start with, we had to figure out what the constraints were in many ways, because there were going to be some, but it's almost that the client wasn't entirely clear what those constraints were. And so we had to do a bit of digging, for want of a better metaphor, to actually figure out what they were and say, well, what are your constraints? Are there resource constraints in terms of, how much money have you got? Are there location constraints? And it turned out that they were trying to work with an existing space because it was going to save them money. So we're like, okay, well, how long have we got in that space, and how much room is there in that space? And let's use that as part of the experience. But we've only got that for 4 weeks, and that's not going to be enough. So maybe the rest of it needs to be online then. So you design out of that the reality of that and say, okay, these are the non-negotiables. Let's start there and let's build out the experience from there. And it's worked really well. It's been very purposeful. It's enabled them to scale that model because it's very intentional. I think they could see why we built it that way. It worked for them. It helped them make the most of the resources that they had, and not design a course that wasn't really going to be suitable for them. So yeah, those are a couple of examples, I think, of where that metaphor has been really useful, I think.
Well, if I can sort of pull it round a bit and bring it back into sort of the metaphor of planting, one of the conversations that I had with the presenter, the Gardener's World presenter, Adam Frost, when he came, and in June, the garden was full of foliage. So and I'll be haunted forever, in fact, by one of the bits of dialogue they did choose to keep in the edit, because I had to do it about 5 times, was where I said, "We like leaves," which is true. We do like leaves. But my point is that one of the conversations we had was around when you think about a plant. Some people think that a plant is a plant only becomes useful or valuable when it produces flowers. So the destiny of a plant is that it has to produce flowers, and yet you've got all this other stuff the plant is doing around foliage, where it's, if you get your eye in, there is such beauty and there's a palette of color in foliage that's sort of literally sumptuous. And I'm sort of reminded of that kind of that sort of shift around teaching resources and constraints, where if you believe for whatever reason that teaching must do this to be teaching, or learning must have these characteristics in order to achieve X, you can experience tragedy and deficit all the time. That you can sort of suffer because the thing you want it to do, it will not do, or the thing that you like it to do, it will not do. And this sort of shift between sort of flower and foliage, again, to sort of not to confuse people, I see that as a sort of a learning design space, really. It's a bit like, why do we think that X has to perform this way in order to be effective? I mean, a great example of this for me personally is that, as you know, I've been doing quite a lot of work in my role as a sort of an adjunct professor at a university in Hyderabad. And you've got the time difference there, for example. You've got time difference, and which is a issue of effectiveness. Really, it's like if you are timetabled to deliver a learning experience over 4 hours and you've got time difference, does that mean that you sort of have to get up at 4 in the morning? Because if you want them to sort of be fresh in the morning to engage with you, is that a problem? You've got like 150 students that you're working with. For me, this idea that teaching had to be me broadcasting in front of the students all of the time in order for my teaching to have quality, in order for the learning to happen, it needed me all the time. And I think some people do believe that for teaching to be teaching and for learning to be learning, the more knowledgeable other, for want of a better word, has to be in front of and present and doing what we're doing now, like, broadcasting. If you think that's what teaching is, and that's the destiny of teaching, something like that time difference is a struggle, because it's a challenge to that. So for me, the idea of sort of flipping things around and facilitating, getting the students to do more, creating these sprint-like briefs, these quick briefs, making videos of myself so I could be present for 10 minutes in the morning so they could get a sense of me, and then they would use the 3-4 hour of the time difference, where for me that would have been like 7 in the morning, whatever. They use that time, and then at the end of the day, I turn up at the end of their day and we reflect on what they did during that time. Because I suddenly realized that teaching could look that way, it solved those problems that in fact weren't problems. I didn't need to solve the time difference. I didn't need to lament any of that. I just needed to find a way to produce a garden, like a learning design response, that was utterly intentional and produced the conditions in those learners that I was seeking to achieve, which was they were autonomous, they were risk takers, and yet the accountability still continued, because at the end of the day, I turned up in a live session, and there was that value as well. So the value of me actually being there, the value of the teacher, I wasn't underestimating that. I just knew that I sort of had to find other ways to be present and to work with the time difference. And for me, that I don't think anyone in those sessions has gone, why aren't we seeing more of this guy? Like, what, it's a bit like, actually, this is working for us, really.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great example, because I think, like you said, this idea of avoiding tragedy is really important. It's so easy, and had so many conversations with people who fall into that and saying, "Oh, I wish this or I wish that." It's often to do with learners themselves. I wish the learners were more intelligent, or I wish they were more motivated, or I wish this or I wish that. And we've talked a lot when we've been doing work for people around helping people teach the students you've got, not the ones you wish you had. And it reminds me of a couple of years ago, we did a podcast with a chap called Jordan Buckner, who was doing a lot of live streaming during lockdown. And he realized that there was a lot of effort was being expended trying to pull the students into a particular space, when actually the students were quite happy hanging out on Discord in a different space. And so that was, in many ways, the north-facing garden. It was like, well, if they're over there, why don't we just go over there? Because they're quite happy over there. And he started live streaming in their space, and suddenly the engagement went right up. So I think there is a lot to be said around this idea of not viewing something as tragic and not viewing it as a deficit, like you say, but working with, or finding ways to work with it and be intentional about it and say, if that's what it is, that's what it is. If you wish it was something else, then good luck to you. Go and teach a different bunch of students. But these students here need this in this situation for these reasons. So let's work into that.
Well, I sort of want to be very clear about this, because sort of in our sort of consultative capacity, really, but also just, just in terms of what it is to sort of be in a space, really, that you do have to be shrewd about the things that do need to change. Because that idea of turn that frown upside down, that notion of resilience. So I think resilience is an interesting one. It speaks to all of this, because I think resilience is a term that we see it again and again and again that educators and trainers want people to be more resilient. And often resilient means problem solving, and it means keeping their knees flexed. It's all of that positive stuff. But sometimes I think resilience has been taken to mean that you just get on with it even if things are bad, that you get on with things even if things are wrong. And so I've seen resilience weaponized, like just cheer up, mate, get on with it, or we're like that here, so just get over it. And I will sort of make a distinction here around the things that you can and cannot change. So, for example, as I said, we looked at the mud in our garden and said, and it was a huge effort. I'm telling you, it was an unpleasant project to excavate that much work. People thought we were mad. It was an effort. It wasn't an easy fix at all. But if we didn't do that bit, it wouldn't have mattered what decisions we then took around the plants most suited to a north-facing aspect. The plants would have been miserable, because the thing that we could change did not allow them to prosper. And so I wouldn't want to be sort of misrepresented here as saying, hey, everything can be great, or hey, you can make everything into kind of an opportunity, because I'm suspicious when I hear that often, because I think it's basically, it can produce a slightly shaming or a guilt relationship to, if you are experiencing a problem, someone else is telling you it's not a problem, it's an opportunity.
Yeah, exactly.
Get over it. But it's really about being really confident about the effect you want to produce, or working with someone closely and really listening to find out the effect they want to produce, and then reflecting that back at them, and having the courage to say, look, there's a lot about this that we can work with, but this practice or this custom or this infrastructure, it's not a fixed point. That's cultural, that's folklore, that's bias, that's underfunding, that's something that you can and should look at and fix. And I think the ability to delicately unpick the differences, that's a skill. That's a skill. So it really isn't sort of like you're not experiencing these difficulties, these are all opportunities. I mean, I think that can be very problematic, but there's a skill in the distinction, I think.
Yeah, there's a pragmatism, isn't there? So it doesn't mean that everything's right, but working with the things that you can change versus the things you can't change.
Yeah.
So then, just to round off, really, so key questions for learning designers. If people have had their interest piqued about the north-facing garden, I mean, what advice would you give in terms of if you were to use this or help or give someone questions as to use the north-facing garden? You've mentioned things like looking for the difference between what is fixed and what is cultural. But what else? What other aspects of the north-facing garden do you think we can tease out?
Well, I think it's a mind shift. It's a mindset thing, actually, because I think this idea of, we've used the word already, but the idea of the deficit model and being alive to that notion of deficit, that presumption of deficit, I would say. And I think anyone who designs anything, actually, when you look at a brief, a good brief, it will be born out not of freedoms, but of constraints. So I would say that the language we use, if you like, sometimes is important. And this notion of expecting and looking for constraints as a powerful design tool, I would say that is always my opening question with a lot of people I meet for the first time. There's a lot of talk, but I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it's a bit like, what is it that will not change? And often when you shake that, you have a lot of more interesting conversations. But I think that's when your creativity as a learning designer can begin. So it's about the language around deficit and constraint. I would say, from a creative point of view anyway, that limitations are the beginning of a strong and purposeful brief. So having conversations around limitations constructively and purposefully is really important. It's almost the most important thing. So that's probably a repetition of the idea of being able to see the difference between things that can and cannot be changed. But it is about being prepared to have a conversation really early around, and not getting into magical thinking with people around, oh yeah, we'll change that when you know it. I mean, I'm always very good on this, like, no, really, so I think that magical thinking about everything can be changed, everything is mutable, often, frequently, always, that is never true. So it's to interrogate that to really find out, to really scope the brief, I would say is basic stuff around a north-facing problem.
Amazing. Phil, thanks so much. That's been a great insight into the links between garden design and learning design. I'm very much looking forward to watching you on Gardens World this evening. And in the meantime,
yes, it's I mean, blink and you'll miss it. That's all I'm going to say. All right. So yeah, but next time, if you could go through my agent, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah. From now on, I'll go through your agent. Yeah. No.
All right.
All right.
Very nice talking with you, Tony, as always.
See you next week.
See you next week. Yeah.